Pacific Islander Month, leading into our Magkaisa event happening in May. So here are those topics for the next few Fridays. We hope that you can join us as we build upon each one of these Fridays with some information in regards to supporting our parents, our staff, and our students in stopping Asian American Pacific Islander hate. And so today, let's see. Okay, so I'm Ms. Luansing. I'm Elizabeth Luansing Garcia. I'm a counselor at Sweetwater High School. Before being a counselor, I was a teacher, English language arts teacher at Castle Park High School. I'm a product of Sweetwater District. I am a graduate of Sweetwater High. My parents are from the Philippines. They immigrated here in the 70s. My dad was in the U.S. Army. My mom was a nurse who landed in Arkansas, then El Paso, Texas, then ended up in San Diego, where she met my dad in El Paso, and they eventually moved to San Diego. And with me today is Mrs. Nancy Garcia, one of my counselor colleagues from Sweetwater. You want to say a little?
Good evening. Go ahead. Good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm a counselor from Sweetwater High School. I have worked in a few other schools. I am also a product of the district before Ms. Luansing, of course, several years before her. My parents as well immigrated here. My dad from the Philippines, my mom from Mexico in the 60s, quite a while ago. I was born here, and so I had a very interesting upbringing, but a very wonderful one that we'll be able to share with you all soon.
Thanks, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you for joining me today. So before we get started with the meat of our presentation, just kind of want to get a feel of where everyone is at in regards to that AAPI current events, the things that are happening in our communities. So this is not really a scale. It's just kind of identifying whether you're a 1, angry, furious, explosive, whether you're a 2, frustrated, annoyed, irritated, a 3, whether you're feeling anxious, worried, and unsettled, 4, sad, negative, or lonely, and then the 5, feeling calm and content with our recent events. So if you're comfortable doing so, you can put your number in the chat and we'll kind of get a feel to what our audience, where we're at today. Okay. So kind of in that 2 to 3 range. We've got a few folks who are angry about what is happening. I think just the climate of race can get to that point. There's some recent things that have happened that I felt kind of angry and frustrated as well. So I understand where that's coming from. All right. So we're kind of in that 2 to 3 range. So today what we're doing is it's kind of our foundation for the next few weeks. Kind of talking about who are Asian Americans, who are our Pacific Islander Americans, who are they, what are they all about? And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about, kind of give you some tools when you hear things that maybe people say or things that people might do that may be seen as microaggressions or maybe a little racist or maybe a little intolerant, how we can react to some of those things. So that's kind of how our evening will go. I am by no means an expert in this category. I think the group of educators who put this together just really wanted to put together a place where we could talk and share ideas and see what we can do to support our community. And so I'm here really as as a second generation Filipino American who was an English teacher, is now a counselor. I'm a mom. My son's listening today because he wants to learn a little bit about what's going on and what he can do with his peers. I did a version of this talk with our Asian club at Sweetwater High School, and they were pretty receptive to it. And so I'm hoping we can open our minds a little bit more today. And I hope I can give you some things to kind of ponder and think about. So unpacking Asian American and what is AAPI. So we're going to go back to our chat here. So we're going to start with when you hear or when you think of the word Asian, what do you think of? What do you see? What thoughts do you have when you think of the word Asian? You can put those in the chat, or if you feel like turning off your microphone, you can do that too. But when you think or hear of the word Asian, what do you think about? Even in light of recent events, what are some things that come to mind when you hear the word Asian? Okay. Family-centered, maybe being blamed for COVID. Hardworking people who care a lot about others. Okay. I think victims right now, like just because of what's on the news and social media. I guess I follow a lot of Filipino advocacy and Asian advocacy groups. So my feed is just filled with just the things that are happening of elder people getting attacked and things. And so that's kind of, those are the images that are on my mind and in my heart right now. Ms. Hokobo says friends and family, relatives and community. Right. Yeah, totally. All right. So our next one, which may be some of the same things you may be thinking about. Okay. Resiliency, resilient people, underrepresented in the media. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Thanks for sharing, everyone. Now we'll move on to Pacific Islander. So when you hear and think of the words Pacific Islander, what are some things that you think about, that you see in your mind's eye? So Pacific Islander, what do you think about? Okay. Do Filipinos, are Filipinos Asian or Pacific Islander? Yes.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That's right.
Yes. They're, for those of you who are here who may not be Filipino or Pacific Islander, there's kind of like this go back in the Filipino community, kind of a back and forth on whether they're Asian or Pacific Islander. And that's a whole other conversation we can have. General grouping of diverse peoples from Asia without any regards to diversity. Yeah, just kind of putting everyone into Pacific Islander, regardless of which region they come from, who they are, and what their background is, kind of a lumping. Sometimes I even think the term AAPI, like that's kind of everywhere right now, AAPI. And I hadn't really heard that term AAPI a lot since college, but with all of this, they've kind of lumped everybody into this AAPI category. Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit today. What about the word American? When you think of, or when you hear of the word American, what are some of the things that you might think of? What are some things that come to mind when you hear the word American? Mm-hmm. So our relatives that occupy the Pacific Islands, white people, opportunity, freedom. I think of when I go to the Philippines, my relatives there don't think I'm Filipino. I'm American there. But when I'm here, I think I'm Filipino. So that's kind of always been a funny identity parallel for me, because there in the Philippines, I'm not Filipino. I'm American when I'm over there. Okay, opportunity, freedom, U.S. citizens. When I hear American, I think of the people and all the immigrants who make up America. Yeah. Freedom, opportunity, English, speaking English is American. Yeah. And then we'll move on to Asian American. What do we think of when we hear Asian American? Yes, Ms. Ruiz. Me too. Me. Yes. Good. Good. Okay. I think as diverse. Asian American is this huge array of people. Born here but caught in the middle of old and new traditions. Yes. Definitely. Definitely. People with descendants of Asia. So whether you're second, third, fourth generation Asian American, yes. All right, so we want to kind of, I didn't move my screen. So let's take a moment and take a look at what some of the people wrote. What do we notice? What was easy to answer? Which was hard? Why? Were there similarities? Were there differences? And what does all of this tell us about the identity of being Asian American? So we can turn off mics if anyone wants to share their thoughts out loud. Is okay.
I found the American one a little bit more difficult to answer than I thought it was going to be. And even though I previewed your slides and was trying to think of my answers ahead of time, when you posed American, it was difficult for me to write. And even though I was born, I am American. But I like what you said. I agree. When I go to the Philippines, it's the same. Like I'm not Filipino there, and I'm not I'm not Filipino here either. Sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. You're not Filipino enough, or you're too American, or you're kind of like balancing and juggling this identity. Like where do we stand? Where do we fit in, right? Anything else people notice about what we said, or how you felt about answering those questions?
I don't know if my microphone's working. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think that, when I hear you and Valerie say that you're not Filipino enough, it's just maybe this perception that we're not fulfilling the expectations of the community of who we're around at the moment. It could be a conflict internally with, wait a minute, am I not doing the right things? Am I not good enough to be, what you want me to be? I think those kinds of questions surface.
Yeah.
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 Especially when it comes to language, because sometimes the language doesn't transfer down, from parents to students. And I feel that with myself, that although I understand a lot of Tagalog, I can't really easily speak any replies back. And that makes me feel inadequate. It makes me feel like I should, know how to speak this, It's my heritage. So there's a bit of feeling shameful about that.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing.
To add with what Laura's saying too, I felt so you were muted, so you couldn't hear what our convos were behind the scenes. But when the first question popped up with what does Asian mean to you, my first thing that I said to Val was, are Filipinos Asian? And then I actually felt a little embarrassed to ask that because I was like, I don't know if that's something everyone fully understands, that there's always this confusion of what are we? And so it's something so small, that little checkbox on a form, but it really does make it difficult for us to really identify with where, I guess you say, where we belong, right? Like, are we with this group or are we with that group? And so in terms of like, are we Asian enough in America versus the Philippines? It's like, well, am I considered Asian enough to check the Asian box, or am I more Filipino or Pacific Islander to check that box? And then, sorry, it's going to go deep here, but also because I'm a little bit more on the morena side, so like more brown, I'm often like, well, technically you're not Asian and you're Filipino because of your skin tone. So sorry, I'm going deep today.
And that's important, because I think part of the Asian identity, whether you're Asian enough or not, is that the your skin color, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're American enough is the skin color. It's a Filipino thing. Like,
yes,
that's important. So it's good that you mentioned that, because that is part of whether you identify as Asian or Filipino or American, based on how dark you are. It's that could be a whole other conversation too about that. But thank you everyone for sharing. Obviously, based on everyone's feedback and everyone's contributions here, we know that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not one type of people. There are several dozens of different identities within those labels. And when we're all lumped together as AAPI in the media right now, that's a whole group of very different people who may or may not identify as being AAPI or Asian or Pacific Islander. And so I think that's kind of come out in some of the things that we've talked about today. So Mrs. Garcia is going to jump in for a little bit.
Yes. So let's define it. So it may include Central Asians, East Asians, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, Southeast Asians, South Asians, as well as West Asians. And with the West Asians, in the U.S. Census, it counts as white Middle Easterners, and they may not self-identify as Asian. And the AAPIs represent the fastest expanding racial group, growing at 4 times the rate of the U.S. total population. And by 2060, we will exceed 47 million. And so I think someone said it earlier, basically Asian Americans are Americans of Asian ancestry. And on the next slide, we have, I'm not going to read all of it, but we have a little bit of a breakdown. For example, West Asian, it's Afghanistan, Armenia. There's just a whole lot of what we might have considered, Middle Eastern, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and then the Southwest Asia. That's where a lot of us Filipinos, Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, and then South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan. So there are a whole lot of areas, Central Asia, like Uzbekistan, and then in East Asia, you'll have the mainland China, Hong Kong, and North and South Korea, Taiwan, Japan. So there's just a whole lot of countries that are Asian, could be considered Asian. Too many to count. And so definitely, I think there's a misconception that all Asian American experiences are the same. My experiences with my family and the way they wanted me to know my culture are definitely not the same as others. And all of us could definitely relate because many of us were born here, some were not. Many of us had both parents who came from the Philippines, or one parent came from the Philippines, one parent came from somewhere else. So we've had all of our colleagues, all of our friends, all of our relatives that we are not all the same. We have not experienced everything in the same way. And as someone who is bi-ethnic, tricultural, biracial, it's what they want to see, and everyone's seeing that. If I'm with my Filipino friends, my Filipino colleagues, I'm Filipino. If I'm with my Mexican side of the family, my Mexican friends, I'm Mexican. If I'm with nobody, I don't know. It's one of those things that it's what they want to see. And so we've experienced it in that way where people who are not Asian, quote unquote Asian, will see what they want to see in you. And they don't know our stories, and that's what's frustrating to many of us. They don't know our stories. They don't know where we're from. They don't, so it's definitely one of those things that is frustrating to some of us. And like I heard a couple of my colleagues here said that you're not in enough of Filipino, for example. You don't know the language, you don't, because you were born here and your parents thought, okay, well, we're going to speak English only, or whatever else your parent might speak. For example, like mine, Spanish. So it's just all those feelings that we've all been experiencing throughout our lives, even now more so with what's happening. So that's definitely part of my side. I have over 50 years of stories, that I'm not going to share right now. It will take forever, but I appreciate everybody putting their responses in chat. There's just so much to talk about. It's just so much.
Thank you.
Anyone want to add?
I appreciate Mrs. Garcia being here with us because she has that bicultural experience. She's a Mexicana, and so she comes with a unique perspective, and so I'm glad that she shared a little bit of that with us today. So thanks, Mrs. Garcia.
You're welcome.
So just a little history on the term Asian American. So the term Asian American kind of came to light during the civil rights movement. We're all familiar with the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, and so the Asian American community felt like the fight of Black Americans for equality, for equal rights, for their civil rights was something that the Asian American community needed to support because they too had their own struggles and their own needs, and so there's power in numbers, and so that term Asian American came from that. And so even from the civil rights movement, we have Asian Americans have been supporting Black Lives Matter. It wasn't called that then, but that's kind of where the term Asian American came from, was from the civil rights movement. In the 1980s, with the census, so the census kind of dictates a lot of how we're labeled. And so in the 1980s is when they lumped together Asian Pacific Islander. So that's how that happened, was in the US Census. And then in 2000, which for some of us doesn't seem very long ago, they split those two between Asian and Pacific Islander. So they became their own separate categories in the US Census. And so Mrs. Garcia gave us a few statistics earlier, but so by 2020, children in America will be a majority people of color. So we're there, that's where we're at. So the majority of children in America today are children of color. by 2043, America will be a majority nation of people of color. So we're going to be a very colorful rainbow in the next few years. And so with that is threatening for some people. With that gives people some anxiety, some uneasiness when they know that the majority of the people around them will look different than they. They'll almost flip. And so that creates a lot of anxiety, and that may be part of why we're having a lot of unrest in our country right now. And so our purpose today is to stop AAPI hate, to give our communities and our students, our families, some resources to stand against racism. We know that the hate against Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have risen since the COVID-19 pandemic. So over the past year, this has become a concern in our communities. We really need to come together, support each other, come together and to use our resources to stop AAPI hate, to inform our communities on what we can do to eliminate, to reduce these things that are happening in our communities. And so to move into the last part of our presentation, have any of you have heard any of these statements, whether said to you, said to others, made in reference to somebody else? I think some of us may have said some of these things already in our conversation today, that maybe we even say them to ourselves sometimes internally. So what are you? Where are you from? Go back to your country has been a thing we're hearing a lot lately. Oh, all Asians are smart. You should be able to figure this out. Oh, you all look alike. Oh, I don't see race. We're all one human race. The where are you from question happened to us, our family recently, to our trip to Grand Canyon over spring break. So we're in line to go on the skywalk at the Grand Canyon, and there's a white gentleman who was monitoring the line and counting people out to go out into this walkway to see the Grand Canyon. And so we get to the front of the line, and the gentleman asks my husband, "Where are you guys from?" And my husband says, "Oh, San Diego, California." And the man gives my husband kind of a ha ha ha. I was just joking, kind of a thing with his elbow. And he kind of laughed and said he was joking, where my husband answered his question. So my husband and I kind of looked at each other and went, "Wait, what just happened?" And then he said, "Your turn." And we moved on to the walkway of the Grand Canyon. So these things happen often in our lives. And sometimes we think, okay, am I going to address that, or am I just going to ignore it and pretend it didn't happen and move on with my day? And so we want to talk about calling in versus calling out today. So when I think back on that situation, am I brave enough to have called this gentleman in or out with that microaggression that he shared with me? So if we want to create change in our communities, we must address instances of microaggressions. And that instance that I shared could be considered as a microaggression. The statements from the previous screen are microaggressions. And these are actions or words that land with harm on someone from a marginalized group like Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. So how do we do that? It's not easy. So calling someone out, I mean, we all know the term, you got called out. Oh, he called you out. She called you out. And it's usually not a positive thing to get called out. It's kind of like, I got called out. That's not a good thing. So when we need to let someone know that their words or actions are unacceptable and will not be tolerated is when we call someone out. When we need to interrupt a conversation, an interaction to prevent further harm. Calling out will likely feel hard and uncomfortable, but necessary. And calling out allows us to hit the pause button in that moment and to break the momentum of how that conversation or that interaction is proceeding. And so what are some examples of calling out someone? So in the instance of this gentleman, I could have said some of these things in that moment. Honestly, I don't know if I am brave enough to have done that in that moment. The man was probably 6 feet tall and I'm 4'11", and it was crowded, and I don't know if I would have done that. I don't know. And it's hard. It's difficult. So when we're talking about calling out, you know, you could say something like, I don't find that funny. Tell me why you think that was funny. I could have said that, since he did a chuckle and a little elbow nudge to my husband. Okay, I'm having a strong reaction to what you just said, and I need to let you know why. Okay. Or that first one there, wow, no, ouch, stop right there. Okay, so there are different ways to call someone out. And these are examples to do that. But what we have to remember is the most powerful thing in some of these situations is to let the person who's the receiver of that microaggression, if it's not you, to hear the words coming from an ally that is there to support them, heard what had just happened, and is calling that person out because it made them feel uncomfortable. It was making some kind of assumption. It was perpetuating some kind of stereotype. That's how we could call somebody out in that particular moment. The other way is to call someone in. So when you call someone in, there's an opportunity to make meaning together and to find a mutual sense of understanding. The purpose is to understand where that person's coming from in hopes that they will try and understand where you're coming from, to explore different perspectives. It's more focused on reflection as to why that was said or why that person did that, versus in calling out, it's a reaction to what had just happened. So ways to call in, you'll notice these are a lot more different. The tone of these reactions are a lot more different. So in that instance, I could have called the gentleman over to a quiet corner and I could have asked them, I'm curious, what was your intention when you asked us where were we from? Why do you think, I don't even know what other one here, which other one we could have used in that situation. But I like the one where it says, how is blank different from, you know, how is asking that gentleman right there where he's from versus asking us where we're from? And I could have pointed out to another white family. How he would have received that, I don't know, but at least it may have given him a moment to kind of think about what it was that he said and how it was received, because maybe no one has ever called him out or called him in before. And that's the important part of that, is that people are called out in those things that they say because they might not know that it's inappropriate. They don't realize that they're saying or doing those things. So as we said, which one's easier, calling in or calling out? I don't know. Thoughts? Which one is easier?
I feel like both are difficult. It's actually something I'm working on. It's growing up, it's been easier for me that if someone makes a comment or a microaggression, I just, because I don't want to ruffle feathers, right? I just go, ha, okay. I had a co-teacher who's not Asian, not Filipino, and she's amazing. She's become one of my best friends. But one of the first things that she's said to me when we first met was, hey, look at that cute Hello Kitty stuff. You like that stuff, right? Because you're Asian and all Asians like that stuff. I do like it. That's true. But I didn't want to be fit into that box and just, well, I'm going to assume this is what you like because you're Asian. And it was difficult for me at first to say something to her. Because I didn't want her to not like me. And so I was like, I let it eat up in me for a while. And then I did say something to her, but then I became very emotional as I said it. And I didn't understand why. So back to your question of calling in or calling out, both are still a challenge for me.
Yeah. And it's hard in the moment. You don't really think of it, like you said, and like my example, you kind of just go, ha ha ha, and forget about it, let it go.
Right.
But then it kind of eats away at you. And when you've heard things like that a lot, it does something to you, right?
Do you think, Lisa, that yours is also similar, like because you don't want to cause that confrontation?
Mm-hmm. Probably.
That was my
yeah.
case.
I mean, it's hard to know how that's going to be received by a stranger, in my instance, but I think in a situation like yours, or I could think of situations in my workplace where I could have called somebody out or in based on something that they said. And I think the conversation would have gone well, but I just didn't have the way and the words to do that. And so I appreciate Ms. Bumatai's comments on these statements, because I actually have, and I shared this with some of the committee, I've been reading this book. The book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Jewell, and she talks about calling people in and calling people out. And so I did a little bit of research online, and I found these scripts and these starters of calling someone out, calling someone in, and it gave me the words to use. And I think they're very useful. They're very powerful. They're written well, where it gives you an opportunity to engage in conversation with someone and not sounding confrontational, which I like. I like these. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. So I love Awkwafina. If you know who Awkwafina is, she's one of my favorite faces of Asian Americans in popular media. And she says, I feel it's important for me to be out there and represent the face. But at the same time, for me as an individual, I think the Asian American face can be crowded with the American identity. And I think we talked a lot about that today, and how Asian Americans kind of walk this fine line, balancing being American versus balancing being Asian American, Pacific Islander, Filipino. And sometimes that can be overwhelming as to how much of which are you really going to use as your face to present to the world. And that's kind of where a lot of our students are. Yeah. Any thoughts about that, anyone?
Carlos put in the chat, tolerance just builds resentment. And that's belief in the case that I gave too. That was true. For a while I was like angry with her until I spoke to her about it. But Carlos, can you clarify some more?
I like that. Tolerance just builds.
Can only text. That's okay.
No problem. I like that though. Tolerance just builds resentment. I think for a long time, the word tolerant, you want to be tolerant.
Yeah.
There's even a teacher magazine, Building Tolerance, where when you put it in that context, tolerance just builds resentment. Yeah. It's kind of like what we're talking about. You kind of just say, oh, well, they're just like that, or they don't know any better, so I'm just going to let it go. And then, it builds resentment. You need to confront. Yeah. Call them in or call them out, whichever one is appropriate for that situation. But that brings us to the end of our time together. So today is April 16th. Next week is April 23rd. We'll be talking about the model minority myth. So we'll be talking about that and how that affects us as educators, your children as students in our schools, and those expectations that are put on them and what that does to them. Some other things to think about as I was putting together the presentation today. There's so much to learn, and there's so much to know about Asian American history. So Sweetwater District is starting has started an ethnic studies class, which a section of the ethnic studies class does focus on Asian Americans. So if you have children that are in our district that want to dive more into some of these topics, I highly encourage them to take ethnic studies. Filipino American history is offered at Sweetwater High School, and I think a few other sites may be thinking about offering it next year. And there are several Asian American studies courses offered at Southwestern College that students can take while they are in high school. So they can take high school special, we call it, and they take a class at Southwestern while they're enrolled in our high schools. And it could possibly count as elective credit for us. So those are great ways for us, or even you, if you're more curious, you could take a class at Southwestern College to learn more about some of these Asian American history type of topics. Needs to be a requirement. I agree, Carlos. Let's work on that. At least ethnic studies. I think ethnic studies should be maybe a semester of world geography and a semester of ethnic studies. But that's a whole other conversation for our educator friends. So are there any additional questions or comments that anyone would like to share before we finish our talk tonight? If not, I'm at Sweetwater High School. Mrs. Garcia and I are at Sweetwater High School. So if you want to reach out to us, you can find our contact info on the Sweetwater High School website. You can message us, send us a message, and we will respond to you. But again, thank you everyone for being here. We hope to see you next week, next Friday, same Google Meet link. Mrs. Ruiz and Miss Macabasco, is there anything else you'd like to mention?
No, but I wanted to also say thank you so much to you and Ms. Garcia for leading tonight. We appreciate it.
Of course, our pleasure. Thank you for allowing us the opportunity to kick this off. This is awesome. I think it's great that our district is doing this and that we've got an awesome group of people that are doing this. What we're doing is awesome. I think it's unique in our county. I don't think any other school district is doing something like this that's led by the educators in the trenches. So this is not something that was put on by your school district. This is something that your teachers, your counselors, your administrators thought was important to bring to all of you. And so if you liked it, please send a message to our district people and say you appreciate us.
We appreciate you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, MC.
Thank you.